established scientist from University of Pisa. Marta is her research is based on physical geography and geology, while Giovanni is geologist, while also professor in anthropology. So Giovanni and Marta and Giovanni, please, Flora.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to this very pleasurable cycle of talks, which is very nice to have in this beautiful museum. I wanted just to make just a short and very brief setup about what you say. I have been an archaeologist before becoming a geologist, because I was fond, when I was a child, of archaeology. And so it was just by chance, because I started working with archaeologists that were historians and had studied geology, that then I became a geologist. But I spent large part of my academic life in the Department of Archaeology, and among archaeologists I'm feeling my friends, and I hope that also archaeologists are perceiving us as friends. Marta is a little bit more geological, but she has also been working on archaeological sites and problems of geology connected to archaeology for many years. And so we have participated in projects and other activities with friends and colleagues of the humanities, establishing good relationships. I hope so, at least. So, considering that we are probably among friends, this was just a very brief summary about what is our job. Humans, environment interact together, and normally humans adapt to the environment. I have put two arrows that go into two directions. It was difficult to show the different timing in one slide, but the environment always influences human activities, whereas human activities started much later to modify the environment. Well, there is a long discussion and argument about the Anthropocene and when it should start or even not exist. But at a certain moment, humans start domesticating animals, after fire and dogs, animals and plants, and they also have to start modifying the environment in order to make it fitter for the productions of these two basic resources, which are agriculture and animal raising. So this is one of the points of contact with the genetics of the cattle. So this is a spatio-temporal system which evolves in time and depends on, at least for the first moments and phases of human evolution, on intense environmental change. And humans produce cultures, and these cultures are adapted in some way to climate change. We also evolve physically, but much slower way, to such sort of environmental change, which is the driving force of true Darwinian evolution. So, sea level change and sea level change in the Adriatic is a very interesting topic. The Adriatic is one of the areas, I don't see seas because it hasn't been always a sea, which has changed a lot through time and becoming in certain moments a vast plain, and then it was reflooded by water, and this probably happened several times through time. It was drying up when the sea level was going down in ice ages, when the production of large ice sheets that were mostly made up of seawater influenced the sea level. So this is a very, very simple and simplistic, I would say, model, and Marta will speak with much more detail about it, which shows how in really short time the Adriatic Sea, that was just a small pool in the southern part of what is today the Adriatic extended northwards, but in even previous times it was as it was more or less now, and so it changed several times, influencing how people could adapt and modify their behavior, cultures and economies in front of this very rapidly changing environment. This is a really icing perspective, freezing I would say, of a period when the sea level was much lower than now, about 100 meters, let's say, at 18,000 years before present, at the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, and from this moment onwards, very slowly and with different pace, the sea level will start rising. We have, unfortunately, no indicators or no clear indicators of what was happening here, unless at a certain moment we archaeologists invent an underwater bell and start excavations under the present-day water of the Adriatic Sea. Or, alternatively, we can wait for the next ice age and have time, but unfortunately it will not be our job. What we have really are caves that are wonderful archives. You know caves. Caves are comfortable in winter because they are warm. They are comfortable in summer because they are fresh. In the middle season it's fine anyway. They shelter us. They have been sheltering people for ages and ages and back in time. Nice that there is a lot of caves on this side of the Adriatic area and much less on the other part, even if there are. Because the present-day coastal area of Italy is not made up of rocks that normally lodge caves. And so, to find caves, you have to go much to the inside, into the Apennines, in an area that has never been directly influenced by the presence of a near coastline or a near sea. So this is just a small number of the many, many caves we have along the eastern Adriatic coast. I have put these ones in the slide just to show the ones that will be quoted within our short talk. What was the aspect of the Adriatic plain in that period when it was a plain? Somebody said it was a desert where was blowing constantly, and it was a place that was not fit for anything, and even less for humans. Other people, myself for example, are convinced that it was not such a bad place. We have some pollen evidence that it was not arborated plain. It was populated mostly by grasses, but there were probably fat grasses that animals, wild animals, could eat and live upon for a long time. And so the typical faunas of the plains, like for example horses or Bos primigenius or possibly bison, but also we have evidence, and Jadranka has told us about this, of the presence of elephants in the plain that were dredged from under the water. So probably it was the real place where Upper Paleolithic people went for hunting and where they could really find the largest part of their resources for subsistence. What do we have? We have such sort of caves of very different size that were different for different purposes in different periods. They can be small, they can be larger, but they all hosted in some way humans that were using them basically for shelter, for themselves, for their wearers, and in the second time for their animals. Now I'm a geologist, I have to show you some geology, I'm sorry. It happens, we like it. This is a profile of the inside excavation of a wild cave. In the upper part of the sequence we have at microscopic level evidence of phenomena of icing within the sediment. So there were small lenses of ice forming inside the sediment when the climate was very cold. And it is interesting that this happens now in a rather deep part of the cave, not in the very deepest part, but some 10-15 meters from the entrance. It's a very narrow cave, and so you must think that the frost was so strong that the whole mass of the rocks had been frozen to the inside. This is interesting because these levels correspond to the levels of the age of Lepus timidus. That is very interesting for us. Lepus timidus is a typically Arctic or cold environment animal, the white hair, and it probably lived in the period corresponding to these levels. If we go a little bit more to the south, and this is a profile of Vela Spila, of the trench that has been under excavation in the very last years, well, you can more or less see here a very dark accumulation of sediments full of organic matter, of ash, of many bones, all fractured and broken for extracting marrow that was a very important food for people. Which means that, at least in this part of the cave, which doesn't represent the whole cave catchment, the cave is very large, there was a concentration of human activities. So they were sheltering in this large cave that is very well lit for basically domestic activities. Then what happens? The sea level starts growing, and all those people that were probably living in the plains and partly sheltering in the caves were pushed out of their primary source of food. And so what happens? What do you do when there is no more food in the supermarket? Well, you go to another supermarket, or if you don't find what is your normal preference, you start buying different things, different foods. And so, not having more large animals, which were a typical game of the Upper Paleolithic people, they started collecting different animals and different sorts of foods. Large plain animals, animals of the plain are normally large, they live in large herds and they are easy to hunt. They produce a lot of meat. When paradoxically the climate is improving, it happens that the woods are growing, are expanding, and in woods the animals are quite different, are smaller. Think about roe deer, for example, the boars. They gather in smaller groups and they escape much faster than the animals of the plains. So they are much more difficult to hunt and they produce less food. And so they started collecting snails, les escargots. They were not invented by French people, they were invented by other people in this area. And when the sea level grew so much that it approached the sites where they were living, they started also collecting seashells, which are much better than the escargot, but they were a very important part of their food. So this is the situation of a growing sea level. The caves are immovable within the landscape. Just the landscape that they could see from the caves was changing. It was no longer a plain, but it had become a wide area occupied by sea, which they could exploit for their needs, for subsistence. Even if caves in some cases became very peculiar environments. This is something we know from Boschian in northern Istria, close to Belauchka. It's a cave with a sequence that includes Upper Paleolithic, includes Mesolithic, and that's strange because it is about 15 meters above the bottom level of Vela Draga, and it is interesting to observe that some sort of sediments are basically river sediments that entered into the cave. This is a sort of bar that was acting like a sort of dam in front of the cave. It was probably originated by materials dropping down from the slope. And evidently the level of the water in the valley could rise several meters, about 10-15 meters, and flood the cave. And this is the ground bar, and everything was filled up this way. And in the bottom of the Villa Draga there are still some small terraces with gravel clearly transported by river, which means that in this period, which has been considered as a very dry period, we are in the younger Dryas, which is supposed to be rather cold but extremely dry, we anyway had phases of strong water discharge, probably derived from the melting of the snows on the mountains or from thunderstorms in specific cases. We also have some evidence of this from the study of the isotopes of oxygen in the shells of the meteors coming from the Gulfs. So, in caves like that one, like in other cases, the Munitsa, somewhat south of Split, there are enormous accumulations of snails. The waste of lunches and dinners of Mesolithic people that had changed their lifestyle and the origin of their resources from big game to something much smaller. And they accumulated all the stuff inside caves, and the caves were occupied by such sort of garbage. This is the Neolithic part. I am preempting what I have to say later, and this is all made up of decayed, mostly sheep and goat dung that were parked into the caves. The approaching sea also provided different sorts of food for those people, but starting not just exploiting snails and clams, but also fishes and marine mammals like dolphins. These are vertebrates of dolphins coming from Venezuela. That's not extremely common, but they show that evidently the seashore was not so far, and they were exploiting that environment for their subsistence. And it's also very interesting to observe the development of the different faunas we find. This is data from Venezuela again, provided by Preston Miracle. In the older levels, the late Upper Paleolithic, we have the horse, which is a typical plain animal, and as well as some roe deer and red deer. Evidently there were patches of wood and better afforested areas. And then these animals, part of these animals, mostly the horse, disappear. You have a continuous presence of the roe deer, but strangely the fox is always present. They were making furs, but there are also clear traces of butchering the remains of a fox. Now, fox is something we don't find in our meals, but they evidently had to integrate the game with something which is not usual, at least for us. And then everything, or almost everything wild disappears in the early Neolithic because it will be substituted by domesticated animals. Domesticated animals that were probably one of the most important resources for the Neolithic people. Neolithic people that had to cope with a completely different environment because better climate, the improving rainfall and higher temperatures favor the diffusion of the woods, and they also evidently had to clear the woods for agriculture, probably in the flatter areas, but we perfectly know that burning woods is a typical practice made by shepherds. So that's probably the very first moment when the erosion of the hillside started, because of different use of much more invasive use of the environment. This is a less freezing impression. I removed part of the white of the snow from it to show that it was a warmer period with the diffusion of the woods. And inside of the caves, we start finding these huge accumulations, in some cases up to 3-4 meters, of partly homogeneous and partly zebra-like or layer cake sediments that derive from inside burning or accumulation of the dung of the animals that have been kept inside caves. We said that the caves are good for humans, they are good also for animals, because you can keep animals safe from predation by other animals, from predation by other humans. Sheep don't like very much to be wetted by rainwater, and so you can keep them inside the cave to protect also them that way. There are different sorts of processes that change the aspect of the sediments. When they are homogeneous, they were probably not burnt. When they are layer caked, they were periodically burned. And this was probably connected with some specific sort of practice and the size of the flocks. If the flock is small, it doesn't accumulate a lot of material inside of the cave, and you don't need to burn it in order to reduce the volume. Sheep and goats eat a lot, and evidently also produce a lot. If you keep them for too long inside the cave without cleansing it, then you will never be able to use the cave again to put the animals in, because it's filled up of this stinky stuff. And you see that from a certain moment, from exactly after the Mesolithic, there is an explosion, and different sorts of animals, mostly domesticated goat and sheep. Pigs are always a problem, because you never can tell how much they are real pigs and how much they are boars instead. And at the very last periods, also cattle start appearing. So cattle don't appear in the very first periods, but just somewhat later. The hair is present mostly in the order levels, because it's, I don't know if it is Timidus or Europaeus, I think Europaeus, but it prefers open spaces. So, the different practices that produced different types of sediments were connected to the size of the flocks. In the first period, during the very earliest Neolithic, there were probably small groups of people, generalists I would say, that had part of their economy based on agriculture, part on the raising of animals, and they had small flocks, and they probably shared the spaces with the animals. And in more recent times, the settlements, probably in the plains and the valleys, started becoming more frequent, more dense and larger, so they had also probably more animals. But you cannot keep the animals close to your village, because they would eat in your fields what you hope will be your food next year. And so you have to keep them very far from the fields during the vegetation period. But if the settlement is becoming denser, then it's not a problem, because I cannot put my animals on your field, because then you would become very upset. And so it's probably the moment when transhumance starts. So you have to take the animals at longer distance in the uphills and the plateaus, and use the caves mostly for stabling the animals. And the number of remains, cultural remains you find in these contexts, is decreasing rapidly and dramatically, because they use the caves for keeping animals, not for living in. Differently in other larger caves, you may have different spaces, not directly shared, but areas for the animals, areas for humans. So just a few words, speaking more about archaeology. We have, well, Stasio has recently produced a beautiful book about a very small island in the middle of nowhere here, which I think was presented here, if I remember well. And this is one of the ways of trade of obsidian from the most important production areas, the Aeolian archipelago, the Alzheimer, Pappalardo, thank you. A small island in another middle of nowhere here that has some obsidian. There is some also coming from Greece, and then in a somewhat younger time also from Sardinia, but that was mostly directed this way. And so they evidently navigated through the Adriatic. We also have two yellow arrows that show the diffusion of people and ideas and concepts. At least in the very earliest Neolithic, extremely earliest, we have cultures here and cultures on the other side that are very similar in Presa and so forth. And on this way, they probably navigated along the islands, and they arrived at this latitude in Istria about 300 years earlier than what the Italians did on the other side, by crossing first the sea here and then progressing very slowly to the north. That's interesting to observe in terms of water circulation within the Adriatic. This is what happens to surface currents flow of water in different seasons, showing that what's happening now, which is not exactly probably what was happening during the Neolithic, but at least we have an idea about this. There were probably specific seasons when those people could move, when in mostly late spring and summer, in fall, there is a sort of gear that starts working this way, and basically it's enough to start from Gargano, to be taken by the flow to Palagrucia, and then you have just to use your oars a little bit to be caught by the other current and be transported directly to Korčula, and then you can go easily into into the inner part of the Balkans through the valleys of Neretva and so. But everything was probably stopping in winter. And there were people using canoes, probably taking animals like cattle and sheep, and they were happily crossing the Adriatic, much more happily than now, because I wouldn't dare crossing the Adriatic on a canoe now, because they would roll me in 5 minutes with oil tankers and that. At that moment it was much safer than now. And so, that's just a fast word about how to start from Italy and approach the eastern coast of the Adriatic, but evidently the wares, the ideas, the people then could also navigate the other way, following this flow. You just have to put your boat in the water from Korčula, and then if you have time, the flow will take you somewhere to the coast of Italy, like a bottle with a message inside. And, I think now that's a moment to pass the witness to Marta, which is speaking much better than I about sea level change and what happened in that period because of the sea.
Well, what I was wondering about working together with the archaeologists and in the framework of this Mendegger project was how could in the past have humans experienced sea level change? I mean, we are now very concerned about this problem, about sea level rise, and we are really frightened of what might happen in a few years, and we think that our houses or the normal places where we live will be flooded in a few years. But I think that we should try and understand how our ancestors were facing this similar problem that they actually had, because they have been living during the glaciation, at least part of them, the late phases of the last ice age and during the deglaciation. And so this problem had affected their life quite a lot. So it is interesting to see how fast they had experienced the sea level rise and how this could have affected their way of living. So, first of all, I need to say a couple of words, just very theoretical, on what we know about sea level change and the causes and how it is occurring, because we cannot just simply think that sea level change is driven by the amount of ice that is melting out inside the oceans. This is one of the components of sea level change, and we call it the eustatic component. So the more ice is melted and the more sea level rises. But this is not so simple, this is not so immediate. There may be phases in which ice from polar glaciers melts and sea level does not rise in all parts of the world, or at least not in all parts of the world simultaneously and with the same speed, because there are other components. So it's not only a matter of how much water you add into the glass, but it's also a matter of how the glass changes its shape, because our planet is made of a crust that is elastic at some point, and so our crust reacts to different loading and unloading. So this may be quite relevant, the isostatic component, and can affect sea level change to a huge amount, as we will see very, very soon. And also we have tectonics. The tectonic component is important because while sea level is rising, the land around a sea basin can rise or can fall. I mean, it can be uplifted or it can be subsiding. So the relative position of water level with respect to land can change significantly based on this. And then there is also this last component, which is quite relevant, especially for small scale sea level change, which is related to the volume of water. The same mass of water can change remarkably its volume, depending, for example, on its temperature and on its salinity. So this is another component. So speaking about sea level change is quite a difficult matter, quite complicated, but we are helped some way by the geologists who create independent evidence about the tectonic component, for example, and especially on the rates of uplift or of subsidence of the land. For example, Croatia from this point of view is quite a complicated area because we have in different parts but quite close to one another parts that are subsiding and parts that are uplifting. And so what we call the relative sea level curve that we can measure in different points can be quite different from one point to the other. And so we can also rely on models. There are geophysicists that build models that are time by time always more reliable and that take in account the eustatic and the isostatic components. And these models, for example, I'm sorry you cannot see these names, but Actually, these are different locations in Croatia, from the north of Istria to the south of Dalmatia. And as you can see, this relative sea level curve, which goes from 30,000 years before present up to present day, so this is how sea level changed from 30,000 BP to nowadays, show a different pattern just because of the fact that this isostatic component is quite different from the northern coast of Croatia up to the southern part of the territory. So this is purely the isostatic component combined with the eustatic component. And you see from this that, for example, the northern part of the country has a different sea level relative to the southern one. So, if we apply that glacial hydroisostatic, which is GIA, the acronym, that the GIA model to the topography of the Adriatic basin, we obtain a sort of paleogeography that is sketched in this map, which is focused on the period about 30,000 BP. So sea level at those times was, in between 85 and 100 meters below sea level, depending on which of the curves, of the isostatic curves you take. And so later, between 10,000 and 17,000 BP, this is what happens actually. Sea level didn't change dramatically, but it remained in between these elevations that you see here. And so what the humans living in these periods could experience was a gradual sea level lowering and then a rise after about 21,000 BP. And so this is more or less the landscape that they could experience. And this is what we call a limiting point, which is a geological methodology to ground truth the position of sea level. Because you cannot rely simply on geophysical models, you have to ground truth geophysical models using what we call indicators of sea level, which is geological features that indicate that at a certain time, a certain part of the land was above or below sea level. And these are stalagmites, which is concretions within caves that are now submerged. And as we know that during the growth of these geological features is occurring necessarily above sea level, they cannot form below sea level. So the presence of this type of geological feature indicates that sea level was lower than the position of where it was. And we have a number of these features for this interval of time. Okay, so what we can try to do to see how humans could face a sea level rise is cross-checking a sea level curve, a model sea level curve like this. You can call it also predictive curve, with archaeological evidence. This archaeological evidence that has been overlapped on this curve that is relative to central southern Dalmatia is inferred from the stratigraphy of the Vela Spila cave that Giovanni has shown to you, at least very succinctly. Well, we can say that during the Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic phase of settlement of the cave, sea level has been changing, not dramatically, but the rate of sea level change has inverted because when the first humans occupied, settled inside the cave, sea level was about 100 meters below sea level, but then it experienced a small lowering, what we call a low stand, and that it started rising again, first very rapidly and then a little bit more slowly. So this is what they probably experienced, and in particular this phase of lowering of sea level is related to a very important climatic event that is testified by a phase of re-advancing of glaciers in all the Alps. So later, so this is basically what the landscape was around the Verastila cave. You see there were not islands like today, but there was a sort of peninsula protruding into the Adriatic Sea, and this peninsula had the most prominent part, including these islands of Vis and Vicemo. And you see this very broad plain was interrupted by quite sharp reliefs. We could call them huts, using a geomorphological term. And if we consider that this is the position of the cave, sea level was located about 10 kilometers walk from the shoreline, was located about 10 kilometers walk from the cave, which is actually for a human used to walking as the Paleolithics were, is not actually a great distance. In spite of this, the archaeological stratigraphy of the cave testifies that these humans were not using fish or shellfish. They relied on terrestrial resources for their feeding and for their activities. So basically in this period, in this Paleolithic period, if we take the average uplift rate, we can say that this was quite moderate. It was compared to what they experienced later. But actually, at the end of this Paleolithic phase of settlement, humans didn't settle inside the cave anymore. So, sorry, this is probably a little bit misplaced. I just wanted to show you here this phase of low stand of the sea, which is related to this phase of cooling of the temperature. So, if we skip to the end of this Paleolithic phase, we see that after this there was a period in which the cave was abandoned. Because, and this phase of abandonment, which is the yellow one, coincides with several facts that were compromising the environment, such as this eruption of the yellow Napolitan tuff. This is an eruption that occurred in Italy, from southern Italy. There was this eruption, but the ashes of this eruption got eastward up to the coast of Croatia, and this probably shaded a little bit the sun radiation, and probably caused a few years of not very good weather in terms of rainfall and of experienced temperature experienced by humans. And also in this phase there was a collapse of part of the cave roof, so this is another thing that could affect the cave settlement. But basically what we see here is also that in the first phase of abandonment of the caves, the rate of sea level rise was very, very much faster than, for example, in the following part, or than what it had been previously in the Paleolithic part. So maybe this has nothing to do with the abandonment of the caves, but anyway, if we consider the environmental general conditions in this part of the abandonment phase, they were not favorable at all. And also during the abandonment phase, another episode of climatic instability, which is namely the Younger Dryas, occurred, and this also affected probably the climate in the area, but this cooling phase probably was responsible of the lowering of the uplift rate, of the rising rate of sea level. Because if you have cooling, you have a reduced melting of ice inside the ocean, and so sea level rises less quickly. Basically, on the whole, we have evidence of human settlement restarting at the beginning of the Mesolithic, and at this point, well, during the abandonment phase, in the meantime, the cave had become, the island, well, Korčula, the site where Korčula is, had become an island. So after this phase in which in the early part of the abandonment phase the first islands start to be separated from the mainland, when humans appear again in Korčula, Korčula had become an island and had been separated from the mainland and from the surrounding islands. So what the archaeological evidence testifies to us is that there is suddenly great exploitation of marine resources and a very lowered exploitation instead of terrestrial resources, because you have a lot of remains of fish bones, of shellfish, and of both for feeding purposes and for ornamental purposes. And instead, those typical animals that represented the main source of feeding for Paleolithics gradually disappears. And this presence of shellfish and of fish includes the presence of shellfish that are used as ornaments, and also the presence of deep water fish that testify that probably people had started navigating along and across the Adriatic. So this exploitation of marine resources actually can be related to insularity, but it wasn't probably the best type of resources that the inhabitants of the island could rely on, because these archaeological evidence gradually disappeared during the Mesolithic. Anyway, what we have to observe about the Mesolithic is also that the sea level rose very rapidly. So the Mesolithics were living on an island, and also the landscape around them was changing very fast. And this is actually a rate that has been probably the highest after this very short phase during the Paleolithic. And so we can say that if very fast sea level rise represents a sort of stress, well, they were the most stressed among the inhabitants of the island. So gradually sea level rise slowers during the Mesolithic, during the Neolithic, up to 6,000 years BP, when actually we can say that most of the ice that most of the melting of ice from the polar glaciers ceased, and little by little we had different shape of the curve that started showing a sea level rise that is really minimal and not due to factors related to the eustatic component. As we see here, this is what happens in the latest phases of the Holocene, and these points testify also that there has been subsidence, especially in the Northern Adriatic, because the indicators of sea level rise can be found lower, in a lower position than the modeled curve. And this means that this can be used to reconstruct the position of past shorelines, provided we are sure that the position of these points is really due to tectonics. So it is necessary to verify the trend of these sea level curves. It is necessary to acquire independent evidence about subsidence in the Northern Adriatic. So finally, what can we learn from this story? We can learn that actually humans living in the eastern side of the Adriatic have been experiencing a sea level rise that has been very variable through times, but sometimes it has been really dramatic, really impressively high. And in the moments of major trend, the sea level rise got up to this value, 17 millimeters per year. That is really impressive, especially compared with this value that is the current estimate of IPCC of ongoing sea level rise. So what did they do according to what is the archaeological evidence? They just adapted. They just worked out strategies of the adaptation. I wouldn't speak of resilience, I would speak of adaptation. And they tried to find the best resources they could find based on what was the environmental situation that they were facing. So this, I think, can be a lesson that we can learn from our ancestors. Thank you.